Good day, everyone from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm taking the prerogative of having this homecoming and celebrating my imminent retirement to say a few words more than I had anticipated. But I think the gravity and the importance of the moment requires that. In June 1947, General George C. Marshall, revered as the organizer of victory and Army Chief of Staff during World War II, and now obviously 5 months into his tenure as President Truman's Secretary of State, addressed the commencement audience at Harvard. The speech he gave described the devastation of Europe's economies and societies. Marshall pledged the United States would do whatever it is able to help rebuild the continent. The world has not seen policy ambition of this size before. Marshall Plan and Europe, as we know it today, was born out of the Harvard speech. The world grew to believe that any grand and systemic US foreign policy is possible, no matter how lofty they may sound. And it became commonplace to say, if there's a major problem, we need a Marshall Plan for this or that. And indeed, what is needed today is a Marshall Plan for climate. The UNFCCC report, which came out last Friday, and this is a part of a sequence of reports that are more shocking and more worrying every day, covered the predominant climate mitigation policy instrument that we know under the Paris Agreement of nationally determined contributions, NDCs. The report contains some worrying findings. The available NDCs of all 191 parties taken together imply sizable increase in global greenhouse gases emissions in 2030 compared to 2010 of about 16%. We're moving backwards. According to the latest IPCC findings, such an increase, unless actions are taken immediately, may lead to a temperature rise of about 2.7 Celsius by the end of the century. This was the statement that was made yesterday by the Secretary General of the UN. But this data, and indeed the Scotia process that we were a part of this year, suggest is that we need to be even more ambitious with our policies in taking on this urgent matter, in taking collective steps to be very specific, not on a vague concept of climate action, but decarbonization, as the world is actually moving backwards, not forward in the current commitments process that is called the UNFCCC. Last week on World Ozone Day, the 16th of September, the day before the report, the NDC report, the Scotia Group released our statement of urgency, which was delivered to the UN Secretary General, which declared an international diplomatic emergency on climate for 9 years. This is a major marker for the Scotia process, which included over 100 experts deliberating and 18 major institutions in a continuous dialogue since the presidential election here in the United States last year, with the goal of making the UNFCCC COP26 Glasgow a success, in a deep hope that Europe will reconcile with the UK and Scotland will reconcile with the UK, within the UK, as a moment of Western liberal democratic action. What was interesting to us that our statement of urgency was particularly gained some ground in China, where I think our message cut through that the US and China needed to work together to address a global policy of decarbonization and commit to energy transition diplomacy, specifically led by my country of origin, Saudi Arabia, by 2030. The work needed is in this international emergency is major. And just as we accepted that COVID was an international crisis, we now need to accept that we are living through another one. With COP26 summit starting in about 40 days, we are now feeling an even greater sense of urgency. So our event today is actually very timely and indeed at the heart of the climate challenge. this is not just about science or science of climate or climate justice or environmental justice. This is really about intergenerational equity, a concept that must be enshrined in law and used as the major policy driver to guide the kind of systemic change we are seeking. We need a Marshall Plan ambition at a minimum, to protect the rights of the next generation and prepare them for what is to come. We need Harvard ambition, the kind that actually really makes America, at least to us, great again and again and again. I had the fortune of having dinner last night with a former professor of mine, Roberto Unger, who reminded me of the progressive agenda. He reminded me that power over an agenda of change lies with those who control the creation of innovation. And in my mind, this is the university, the scholars, and its students. I'm grateful to Boston University for making the first call, the University of St. Andrews, University of Cambridge, Queen Mary University of London, the IBA, and the University of Glasgow as we go forward, and Oxford next month, during COP26 on November 11th, which coincides with Armistice Day. We're calling it Scotia Day, which will be a reminder for generations past and generations to come. I'm also delighted to welcome our 18 Scotia Fellows who are with us for this dialogue. Welcome. And I'm so thrilled that we will be hearing from them later today at the iPlatform Prize Majlis, where the Stanley Hoffman and Louise Richardson, other award will be given. And those are indeed Harvard, there are Harvard connections there. The Scotia Group and Innovation Platform, iPlatform, were both founded on the belief that it is only by engaging in a genuine intergenerational dialogue that the biggest climate challenges can be overcome. Ensuring the success of COP26 summit is something that I believe can only be achieved through the formulation of intergenerational equity policies, not young people's anger, but the incubation of their policies and ideas and interests. For that, we must listen to future generations, as we will hear today, and as well as hear our Scotia members speaking going forward, using their experience in international climate negotiation. I've spoken more than I wanted, but let me just say that we have tried to engage with younger scholars and thinkers during our dialogue and majlis. There was pushback, and I believe that this session is probably, in my mind, the most important one. And I wanted to thank the Harvard Weatherhead Center and Professors Melani, Cammett, and Dustin Tingley for allowing us to hear from some of those voices during our dialogue session today. A big congratulations and a vote of confidence to Melani, my dear friend, who has taken on the directorship of the Weatherhead Center, a center that played a major role in forming foreign policy in the United States. And I hope under her steady hands, we'll be seeing more of that. I should also mention that she was one of the first people to call on a policy that I continue to encourage her to build on when she wrote for the Safra Center on Ethics, an article by the title, Building Solidarity, Challenges, Options, and Implications for COVID-19 Responses. It is that kind of solidarity, precisely this topic, that made us put solidarity as a concept in our note, as well as the concept was used by the Secretary General yesterday in formulating his statement. Dustin, of course, is a hero for us at iPlatform as we continue to think about teaching and learning and trying to incubate ideas. His methods we try to employ at Al-Zatari camp in Jordan. And thanks to Prince Hamza al-Hussein for his support in giving us access to the camp and trying to help some of the lost generations to learn. I have no doubt that Harvard will set the course for some of the most creative policies needed to address the international diplomatic emergency. And yes, I'm putting them to the challenge because I have great faith in my alma mater. We very much see today's dialogue and the contributions to come from the Scotia Group Fellows as the start of the process and their idea will feed into a report being drafted by the Scotia Group, which will be sent to the United Nations Secretary General, President Biden, as well as Prime Minister Boris Johnson next month. Thank you so much, and over to you, Melani.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to co-host this event, this dialogue. Climate change is obviously the most pressing global issue. It's existential for every one of us on the planet. And I really think it's imperative that we at the Weatherhead Center engage extensively with the challenge of addressing climate change, which of course is much more than a technical problem. It's a political problem as well. And so I think there's an important role that researchers at Harvard and around the world can play in addressing this challenge. And I'm particularly delighted to have young people here who are working concretely to address this challenge. As Malik alluded to, confronting climate change requires solidarity at multiple levels, at the international level, all the way down to the very local community level. In general, we know from research on collective action that it's easier to construct solidarity at a local level in a community that feels more that they have a sense of we-ness, as some scholars have put it. But it's obviously a challenge that requires solidarity at much higher levels where it's more difficult to construct. And solidarity also is essential at the intergenerational level. You know, I'm quite aware of narratives, justifiable narratives from younger generations that the planet that has been bequeathed to them has been, you know, destroyed or potentially destroyed by older generations. And I think we have an obligation to do everything we can to work towards addressing this incredible challenge and to supporting younger people in addressing it. So I'm going to briefly introduce Dustin. I could go on and on describing his many achievements, but I'll be very brief and then turn it over to him to introduce our speakers. My colleague, Professor Dustin Tingley, is a professor in the government department at Harvard. He also holds many, many hats. I don't know how he sleeps. He's the Deputy Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. He's the Faculty Director for the Harvard Higher Education Data Science Group and Faculty Director for the Harvard Initiative on Learning and Teaching. He holds a PhD from Princeton in politics, and his research interests include international relations, international political economy, data science, and of course, climate change. And he's starting an important initiative here at Harvard to promote cutting-edge research on climate change. He's received a number of awards for his academic research, which is very extensive, too extensive to recite here. And he's engaged in projects at the moment that address attitudes towards global climate change, climate technologies and policies, as well as a number of projects related to social science methodology. And he teaches courses on data science, international relations, and climate change. So I'm going to turn it over to Dustin. Really grateful that he's helped to organize this event and all the work he's spearheading on climate change at Harvard.
Thanks, Melanie, so much. And thank you all for joining us today. And thank you furthermore for the broader Scotia community. I think it's such a fabulous collection of individuals and organizations, and my thanks, Professor Dahlan, for taking the lead for us. So before I introduce an amazing group of speakers today, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're trying to do here at Harvard in order to really try to engage with the sort of future young leaders and their experiences and their passions. So I'm going to mention some examples only as illustrations of how an educational institution is starting to transform itself, right? There are many other things that I won't mention today, but I think it's important for us to have a sense of higher education as playing a role in facilitating future leadership. So one of the challenges at Harvard that we face is that is offering courses that are squarely about climate change. But fortunately, we've had the creation of the environmental science and public policy major. Classes in economics are now more directly engaging in the topic. And disciplines like political science will be offering the very first lecture course squarely on the topic of climate change this spring, with parallel operations happening in areas such as sociology and the humanities. Another challenge is finding opportunities for students who actually want to work in this space and facilitating that. So for many years, the Harvard University Center for Environment has offered research assistantship positions, and that's been tremendously successful. But this past summer, the Center for Public Service and Engagement funded a program that brought together students working as either research assistants on the one hand, but also people that we placed in internships working in various NGOs on climate, and got everyone together and really had the opportunity to exchange insights from more the academic perspective, but also the more practitioner level perspective. Another challenge that we face is that our pipeline of researchers in this area is not as strong as the demand needed by the problem. Okay, so in my home discipline of political science, we actually have very few PhD students who are doing anything related to climate, even though there's a broad recognition of the scope and scale of the problem and the need for creative social science thinkers. And so fortunately, the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs is funding a program we're calling the Climate Pipeline Project to really try to get younger scholars into the mix, network them in the context of more senior scholars, and help propel their careers forward. The list could go on. My colleague Daniel Bicknell at the Kennedy School is convening an Arctic Indigenous Youth Study Group to really highlight the experiences of youth leaders coming from the Arctic region and their struggles with climate change. Our students are hungry for experiences that will help them be a part of the solution. Many feel left out, and some alienated by a burden placed upon them by previous generations. Equity to them means solving the problem and not being a part of the problem placed on generations after them. As an educational institution, these are some of the things we're doing that put equity and solidarity at the center of the table. So with this, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I'll be brief in introductions. Alexandra Konevska is a PhD student in the Department of Government. She's motivated by a passion for developing solutions to address climate change, and her research is squarely in this space. A recent project that she'll speak about today is the relationship between youth attitudes on climate and their propensity for being mobilized. She's published numerous peer-reviewed articles, even as a PhD student, and has a super successful career ahead of her. Prior to coming to Harvard, she worked as a consultant for the World Bank Group. So with that, may I please pass it over to Alexandra.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dustin, for that great introduction. And thank you to everyone who's joined today to hear this important event. And of course, for everyone for putting in the work. I'm sure it was a ton of work during COVID to create this important group, and also for taking the initiative now to ensure that young voices are heard. I don't think enough of that is happening. So I just want to give my appreciation. I'm going to start by just going over what we know about generational attitudes on climate change, which is surprisingly not much. So essentially, large public opinion polls in the United States and Europe, which is so far my research focus, show that Gen Z and millennials believe that climate change should be a top priority at a much higher rate than Gen X and boomers. But we probably already know that based on the amazing actions that we see around the world that youth are engaged in. Fridays for the Future, Extinction Rebellion, the list could go on. But it's not clear entirely like how this actually leads to action, right? And I mean, the public opinion polls also indicate that youth are much more likely than older Americans to favor proposals to shift US energy reliance away from fossil fuels and towards more renewables. So they're also more in favor on the action side, it seems. And moreover, a greater number of youth, they're in favor of phasing out fossil fuels entirely. They want no more fossil fuels in the energy mix. This is something significant that showed up in several polls compared to Gen X and boomers. And all of this makes sense because youth have a unique positionality, as we've discussed earlier. And because of this, they unsurprisingly have a unique emotional experience of climate change. Beginning your life in a world that you're told is collapsing, I mean, that's a highly emotional and existential experience. I've never even conceptualized an idea where our world just exists and we just have this pure space to breathe and live. And so this can help us to understand why these existing polls indicate also that the role of hope and despair, they're much more significant components motivating climate action amongst youth than adults. While this is new and inconclusive body of research, a lot of the work is strong in indicating that hope isn't the only motivator for young people, while older people have been shown to also be motivated by fear and by hope, mostly fear for their children. But there's a problem with this, because we also know that youth tend to ascribe more climate responsibility to the government, corporations, and older generations. They acknowledge, and I think that their despair is inextricably tied to the structural nature of the problem. In both polls and large numbers on social media, we see youth pointing to corporations, the government, and the structural issues at hand, rather than themselves, their peers, or individuals, which overwhelmingly adults tend to ascribe responsibility to. So they believe that the government and corporations are the ones responsible to take the most action. And it's not that action stops there, but it's that there's a very likely relationship between this responsibility ascription and mobilization, because the belief that it's a structural problem that corporations and the government are responsible for, it leads youth to be less inclined to take their own individual personal action. And so what I've seen in these polls is that while youth tend to state that they're very willing and they do report high levels of public sphere action, such as protests, signing petitions, they report much lower levels of individual action, such as cutting red meat and taking public transportation. And these things that feel like moot to them because, you know, what's the incentive to make a lifestyle change if it's never going to be sufficient? And so, you know, while we still see them report public sphere action, there's a great risk that this disillusionment, this disenfranchisement, it's hindering levels of other forms of action. So the amount that they're willing to go protest, the amount that they're willing to engage in public action, because those emotions are so strong. And when you feel despair, it's crippling. Without hope and a feeling of agency, as we've discussed earlier, many youth fit into what some academics have categorized as the climate paralyzed. This is a group of people who care. They care a lot about climate change, but they're so overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis and feel so far removed from the solution that they fail to act in their daily lives. And so there's clearly a relationship between hope, happiness, and an understanding of responsibility ascription. And a lot of the work that I'm researching right now highlights this role of emotion. It indicates that emotions may be rooted, at least in part, in this what seems like an impenetrable systemic issue, this structural part. So an open question then is if and how these emotions divide generations in a way that makes it difficult to achieve intergenerational mobilization. For youth, it might feel too alienating to join climate action workspaces dominated by older generations because they may feel their seniors don't understand what it's like for youth to begin in this world. And moreover, they may even feel that they have this approach that they prefer to addressing the issue that's entirely different from seniors. They want extreme transformational change because their perspective tends to be different. And in a way that's alienating for individuals because it's a red line. If they don't seek commitment to transformations, they don't want to engage at all. It's just too despairing. And so the question as well is how can we engage and empower youth on multiple dimensions of climate action, public, personal, all types, while still allowing them to acknowledge and address that other actors may need to bear the brunt of responsibility and that systemic transformation is crucial. And so I'm here to highlight these pieces of friction, but I also want to cast hope myself and show how with open dialogue, like what we're having here, and an understanding of these potential problems, we can begin to address these frictions. And hopefully with all of our strength and all of our resources, we can find a way to have a dialogue, to communicate these differences in our experiences and work together. So I'm hoping that in these conversations, we can talk more about this, but thank you so far for your time.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Very moving words, and want to next introduce our speaker, Naomi Davey. Naomi's an undergraduate at Harvard University in Winthrop House She's a social studies concentrator focusing on international environmental law and justice. She has an interest in politics and law, and as a Washington, D.C. native, intends to pursue this passion at law school one day. She's particularly interested in how environmental issues impact minority communities, and she hopes to one day be an environmental lawyer. So without further ado, let me please pass it over to Naomi.
Hi everyone, I'm Naomi. Thank you so much for coming today. It's truly an honor to speak in front of all of you. I'm excited to see so many people engaged on climate and to have young voices at the table. I think that's something that, of course, we're definitely more aware is a large component of this conversation. As a young person myself, today I just want to talk about what motivates me and what I think motivates a lot of young people that might be a little bit different from what has motivated other generations. So a little bit of background about me. I am a current senior in college. And this summer I worked at a nonprofit organization called Dream Corps. It was an organization started by Van Jones with the mission of making sure that we have a just transition into a new green economy. So I'll talk about a little bit what that means, what my work was, and my work moving forward as I graduate from this institution. So as a young person this summer, working on these missions, I found that the climate conversation has shifted a little bit. For a long time, it wasn't attractive to people of color, to young people. People have historically been excluded from the climate conversation. And I think now we're taking a more intersectional view about what it means to have a just transition into a green economy. What does it mean to be talking about climate change today? Who are we involving in the conversation and who will be impacted? So as we know, not everyone is going to be impacted in the same way by climate change. I think that the wealthier, the whiter, the people with privilege in this society are not going to see the full effects of climate change. There are ways to innovate out of it. There are ways to avoid it, to mitigate it. And so being aware of the structural systems that exist before we even have a climate disaster will make sure that we have a more equitable response to climate change, and we really understand who's going to be impacted the most. So that's a lot of the work that I was doing this summer, particularly looking at housing structures and what does it mean in a place that experiences more extreme weather, hotter temperatures. How is that response to climate going to be mitigated? How are we going to look at the particulars when it comes to climate change? And that's a conversation that I think more young people are having today. We're being raised in a society that's more conscious about race and structural racism. We're more conscious about capitalism and what that's done to our society, and how inequalities within our society are exacerbated by the climate disaster. In many ways, yes, the climate disaster is a human creation, but the way we can respond to it and the problems that exist are also a human response. It's not that there's going to be a climate disaster and inevitably everyone is going to feel the impacts. There's actually ways in which we have made it worse for some and better for others. So that's some of the work that I've been doing this summer. Moving forward, I'm going to be doing work on housing discrimination and environmental racism and environmental justice. So what that looks like for me is looking at how communities of color are impacted by environmental degradation, by pollution, by the disproportionate burden on them, and the history of housing discrimination and how it's made it a lot harder for those communities to mobilize, to have their voices heard, because they don't have that same political clout and power when it comes to protecting their own communities. As a young person, I do think I'm motivated a lot by this issue just because I know that this is going to affect my generation. And I think it's the most important issue we can be working on today. But I do think it has presented us with a unique opportunity to completely rethink the structures in our society, to rethink our political processes. What does it look like when we're talking about climate? What barriers have we put in place that make it harder for us to make these structural changes? Looking at our social stratification. What exists right now that's going to make the climate conversation a lot harder? Who are we not listening to when it comes to climate change? Looking at economic structures. I was working on a project where we were looking at energy efficiency And of course, we want everyone to have energy efficient housing. It reduces emissions, it makes people more comfortable, it's safer for humans. But most of the people who have access to brand new solar panels and great installation are not people of color or poor people. So how can we include that in that conversation and make sure that we all move into the future together? Those are the kinds of issues that I've been thinking about a lot. And I think more and more these days, young people are switching the climate conversation to make it less one-dimensional, to look at the ways in which this affects every aspect of our lives. And a new green economy truly will involve everyone being at the table. So that also means within the government, making sure that we are providing grants to more people. We have an opportunity to make sure that minorities and people of color and people who have been excluded from the conversation, women, are involved in that transition, that they have the opportunities for innovation, they have the opportunities to create local changes as well. And it's also just a much more efficient way because those are the people who really know what the needs are in their own communities as well. So for me, intergenerational equity involves a lot of different things. It does mean that we are protecting future generations and we're keeping them in mind. And we understand that we have an obligation to young people, but it also means listening to their new perspectives on this, understanding that maybe there's a dialogue that they're having that we haven't necessarily been having in the past. So that's the work that I'm dedicated to. That's the work that I want to continue to do once I graduate. Dustin mentioned I do want to go to law school, and I think that's where a lot of I could build those tools and have those skill set to make those structural changes moving into the future. So thank you so much again for having me. I'm again super excited to have these conversations. I talk about this all the time incessantly. So yes, I just want to thank you all.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Inspiring would be an understatement. So thank you for all of your passion and your incredible articulateness in expressing it. So our last speaker, and as I'm getting ready to introduce her, there will be some time for some Q&A. And so please start to formulate maybe some of the questions you might have for our incredible panelists. So our last speaker is Clea Schumer. She's a research analyst on the climate and economics team at World Resources Institute, or WRI, where she supports the research, analysis, and outreach efforts of the WRI projects focused on raising national ambition in accordance with the Paris Agreement. Her work helps to improve the understanding of national and global ambition for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and uses data and analysis to inform and influence a set of international climate policy stakeholders. Prior to joining WRI, she completed her undergraduate degree at Harvard, where she earned a degree in the Environmental Science and Public Policy program, which I mentioned before, focusing on climate economics. And during her undergraduate education, she worked at the Harvard Office for Sustainability and held internships at the California Energy Commission and the C40 Climate Leadership Group. One last personal anecdote. This is something that all professors just are so proud of. I'm a little teary myself right now. I got to teach Clea in an introductory international relations course, I think when she was a freshman, and I was blown away by her then, and I'm sure we're going to be blown away by her remarks now. Clea, let me pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dustin, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all so much for having me. Like Naomi said, it's an honor to be able to speak with you all. So my name is Clea. I graduated from Harvard College last year in 2020 with the degree in environmental science and public policy. And I want to talk a little bit about jobs in the climate and environment realm, since I am just a year removed from college or a PhD program. Not in the PhD program, but removed from being in school myself. So after finishing my degree and after having devoted a lot of my time during college and before it to learning about the climate crisis and advocating for change within my own communities, I was very eager and felt very ready to put my knowledge and my passion to practice and find full-time work within the climate policy realm. But this turned out to be a little bit more of a challenge than I had been anticipating. So what I found, in fact, was that jobs for young people within climate-related public service organizations, as well as in government and corporate entities who were working on climate, were few and far between. For every one job posting I came across during my search, my classmates and friends who might be working in finance or management consulting might find 10 or 20 relevant positions. Sometimes I would find what looked like an entry-level job that seemed very well suited for my skills and my interests, and then would learn thereafter that a minimum of 3 to 5 or 10 years of work experience after college would be required. The question was, how was I going to get that experience if the field I wanted to work in would not take me out of college? On top of general lack of jobs in the field, I also kind of noticed this informal and non-streamlined recruiting process that made it really hard to be noticed by a lot of companies and organizations working in the climate and environmental realm. So during my job search process, I'd often submit a resume and an application to a position that I found online, knowing that it would sort of land in this black box, as people call it. And it was unlikely that a human would ever really even read my materials amongst the 100 or 500 or 1,000 applications that might be submitted for a single position. I can tell a quick anecdote also now, a year later, working within one of these organizations. We posted an internship position this last summer for one intern that we had the capacity to host. And within one day, there were 500 applicants and absolutely no humanly way possible to go through them all. And so I think this just highlights from my own experience and then from my friends that there are a lack of these kinds of positions, and there is just simply more interest than there is right now capacity for taking these people on and bringing them into the field. I'll say one more thing about these challenges, which is the vacancy-based timeline that a lot of these organizations work on. So from my experience, a lot of the places that are doing climate work only hire on short notice when a new position opens up, or maybe when a new grant or a piece of funding comes in. And this is totally understandable given resource and capacity constraints, some of which we should be working to combat. But you can understand why it's challenging for young people who are seeking security and stability. And again, compared to these management consulting and finance firms who show up to campus in September to recruit students to start work the following year, you can see why students who are wanting to work in climate and environmental fields feel this challenge and are not afforded the luxury of knowing that they'll have a job after they graduate. From my experience, from my friend's experience, you usually have to graduate, remain unemployed for several months while you look, and then hope that you land something soon after that unemployment period. But that's a huge barrier to entry that not everyone is comfortable coming to terms with, and it's a huge barrier to joining the field. So all of this is to say is that between lack of job availability and then this sort of unclear and informal recruiting process, the uncertainty and challenges of finding work in the field can be really, really hard to break through for a young person who is devoted to climate, but might not have the time or the flexibility to go through a process like this, despite having the passion and the knowledge. The flip side to all of this is that once you land in the right place, the process, no matter how challenging, feels very well worth it. So a few months after graduating and almost a year after I had initially started to look for work, I got my dream job as a research analyst with World Resources Institute, or WRI, in their climate and economics program, as Dustin mentioned. And my role on this team is to work on projects to raise national ambition in accordance with the Paris Agreement. So to this end, we support countries as they put together their near-term nationally determined contributions, NDCs, their long-term low-emission development strategies, net zero targets they may be thinking of communicating. And the work over the last year has been more meaningful to me than I really could have imagined, as I've had the chance to work on projects that I feel can and are already driving meaningful change, and have been able to meet amazing mentors who have taught and inspired me so much about this field and about this urgent issue. just to mention a few projects I've had the chance to work on recently. We published a paper yesterday, actually, that presents insights when looking across all of the long-term low emission development strategies that have been submitted to the UNFCCC, identifying common trends and challenges. And I also had a chance to work on a modeling study that came out last week that projects the temperature rise impacts of countries' current 2030 and 2050 climate goals versus temperature outcomes we might actually achieve as a global society of countries that are more ambitious near-term and long-term mitigation and adaptation goals. I believe in this work thoroughly and wholeheartedly. I derive real meaning from it. I feel incredibly gratified and fulfilled by what I'm able to accomplish as a young person working in climate. And that's why I wanted to just acknowledge that there are challenges and gaps to getting here. It's well worth it once you cross them. But yeah, to wrap up, I want to just say that the work is incredibly gratifying to the people who are able to pursue it. And we really need to work together to break down barriers so that more students and young people can access paths for working in this ever-present and urgent field. To me, this means creating many, many more positions that are earmarked for young people. It means designing internships, maybe in partnership with universities who can fund them, as Dustin did this summer, to open more doors for young people. And it means streamlining these recruiting processes so that the process of finding climate and environment related work is clearer and more accessible for young people who want to use their skills and their passion to drive this meaningful change. If we don't solve these problems, we run the risk of turning away young and passionate and energetic people, when in reality, I think we all know here that we need every single hand on deck for this crisis. So that's it. Thank you so much again for listening and for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Clea. That was inspiring, just as both Naomi and Alexandra were. So I was going to bring in my 4-year-old to give her prepared remarks, but we had to take her over to, my wife took her over to daycare. And, you know, it is interesting to see kids, young kids, start to talk about this. My son sometimes hears the word climate change around the house and is just sort of inquiring, and it's sort of distant. It's in, you know, the best we can explain is, you know when it gets really hot outside or it rains really hard, are you comfortable? And, you know, I think the reality, and something I just want to give a nod to prior to opening this up to Q&A that Melani is going to moderate, is that experiences of my kids and the experiences of Clea, Naomi, and Alexandra are very different than the experiences of young generations that are living in less developed places. And I just want to make sure that we embrace some of the themes that Naomi mentioned from an international perspective about the challenges that the developing world will face, and that the kids in the developing world will face as they grow up in a much more turbulent environment than they otherwise would have. The need for change is present. We are able, and it's inspiring to have younger leaders such as Alexandra, Naomi, and Clea to speak with us today. So let me pass it over to Melani, who can moderate a Q&A for a couple of minutes. And we invite you to ask some questions and provide perspective. So Melani, let me hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Dustin. Thank you also to our 3 excellent speakers, really inspirational. We were speaking earlier about how much despair there is in young generations right now. And I think what was wonderful about this panel is to hear from people that are taking action. Also, the presentations were incredibly complementary because we have 2 people that are focusing in a very concrete way on professional careers, concretely addressing the challenges of climate change in their own work, in their professional ambitions. And then we hear from Alexandra how young people are viewing the crisis and what motivates them and demotivates them to take the kind of life choices that Naomi and Clea have adopted, among others. So really exciting to hear this work. And I hope we can share the video of this event far and wide so young people can listen to it. So I'm going to open it up to Q&A. We can actually take a little bit of extra time because of the technical difficulties that we faced at the beginning, letting in a number of our attendees. And I want to recognize also President Salinas, who is here with us today, a core member of the Scotia group. And we're really honored to have him here today. And I wanted to see if he would like to kick us off with any questions or comments. Otherwise, I'm happy to open it up more broadly. President Salinas, did you want to speak? Oh, I think you have you're muted.
Does it work now?
Yes.
As you said very properly, the three presentations were working very well together. And what I wanted to mention is that being very impressed by the enthusiasm of Naomi, I think there's also, or should be, some anger in her because of the conditions that our generation is inheriting to theirs. And what I was wondering, and perhaps they could illuminate us, the three of them, is the question of impact in terms of society, in terms of politics, and impact depends on quality and numbers. And this calls for certainly participation, but also organization which demands discipline. And so we arrive at the question of political parties. And I'm very interested in hearing their feeling towards participation in political parties and what would they demand on parties that are supposed to be committed with the environment and not merely trying to gain some votes from younger generation by talking about the environment, but not really delivering that presentation. That is, they could help us very much gather an idea of the prerequisites for real parties committed to this struggle, which is everybody's struggle. Illuminate us, please.
I could go ahead and create some sort of response. So thank you so much for your question, President Salinas. I think when I was talking about the opportunity to rethink some of the structures in our society, and especially political structures that might have stood in the way of further and more radical climate action, I really do think about the party system and how in this country, democracy sometimes isn't pure. And that means that there are incentives beyond the will of the people. If you take polls of young people, of even people just on older generations in this country, most people, I do think, want to see a clean future for all of us. But I think that the sway of oil companies, the sway of certain food systems, and just the idea that money can actually control politics more than people has not only been a barrier to climate, it's been a barrier to education systems, it's been a barrier to healthcare, it's been a barrier to a lot of things that actually young people and just people in this country want to see change. So I think that because climate is such an important issue, we have an opportunity to think about, okay, if we all want this, what are those barriers and what exactly can we do to change our political systems to make sure that this doesn't happen again for such an important issue and for this one right now, because we really don't have an option when it comes to climate.
Would anyone else from the panel like to speak before I turn it over to more Q&A?
I just want to add one example from the Canadian context. I think it highlights a little bit of why maybe some Canadians youth are very angry right now. So we have a multi-party system in Canada, and we have had the Liberal Party in power for several years now. And they had stated that they promised electoral reform, and that electoral reform would have better reflected the desires of the population. It would have stopped being a first past the post system. And this was very important for climate action. It would mean that much more serious action could take place. But the problem is that these leaders, they don't want to, once they're in power, they have no incentive anymore to actually make the electoral change, because it makes them less likely to win in a secondary election. And so that's one of the most disillusioning things you can experience as a young person, because you feel you never have the chance to make that kind of change. And there's no way to really do that because the people who do have the power, they don't have any incentive. And so I think in terms of facing those types of struggles, we also need to look outside of the party systems and work with corporations, who we need to strongly state. And on this amazing program that Dustin organized this summer, we had a head of McKinsey join us for a talk. And he talked about how young people now, they no longer are okay with just not caring about the social component of their work. And so we see young people taking this to their employers as well, and hoping that that actually will, further motivate action outside of the political process.
Great, thanks so much. I have two questions that have popped up in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time for more after that. Clea, did you want to say anything first before I turn on? Okay, great. So from Victoria Preston in the chat, directed at Naomi. Naomi, would you respond to Clea's comments about how hard it is to break into the field of climate change related work, and especially in light of racial and socioeconomic and other inequalities? So that's one question I want to throw out there for Naomi. And then we have another question from Alex Weiler in the chat. It seems that a lot of grassroots environmental action is gathering, gaining momentum, and is pushing governments to realize the emotional burden that young people feel surrounding climate change, as Alexandra was discussing earlier. However, a lot of this work is based on volunteer work and seems disconnected from the policy level of climate action. Participation does occur, but not in a way that power actually shifts. So I'm wondering if you guys could comment on that. Maybe Clea could take the lead on that second question. So Naomi, you want to start?
Sure, thank you so much for the question. I do think a lot about this, and as a young person and a young Black woman who wants to go into the climate space, I think one of the most important things that will change the reality that a lot of young Black people face when facing climate is representation. So personally, growing up, I did not see a lot of minority representation in the climate space. And even the conversations that people were having around climate, it seemed like a more privileged discussion. It seemed like a tree hugging kind of phenomenon, whereas many minorities in this country are facing water purification issues. They don't have clean air. They don't have food access in their community. And so we're starting to have more and more of those conversations, which is why I think more and more people of color are interested. But still, this field is very white. And I think a big part of that is just the perpetuation. If you see people like you in a field, you think you can go into it. It's a psychological phenomenon that happens. If you don't see anyone like you, you think this has nothing to do with racial issues. This has nothing to do with my community. Why would I go into it? And so the work that I want to work on is the intersection between the two, understanding that climate has everything to do with social inequality, it has everything to do with economic inequality. It's not just a white person issue, and it's not just a Black person issue. And so I think when I go into the field, looking for those mentors of color, making sure that I myself am a representative to other young people of color who want to get involved is super important. And I've seen that in my work this summer as well. There are more and more programs. I was looking at programs in Baltimore that talk about access to healthy food. And Van Jones obviously is starting this huge conversation around race and climate. So just to answer the question briefly, yes, I do think that there has been a historically large barrier to minorities getting involved in the climate discussion, but I'm really hopeful that that's changing, and I hope to be part of the solution as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex, for this question. I think there are a few pieces, and I wanted to just talk about the volunteer remark first, which is that I agree a lot of the opportunities that I think are available to young people are volunteer-based. And while I commend people who do that in their spare time, I also acknowledge that we all have limited capacity. And I acknowledge that people who want to work in this field deserve opportunities to be able to do it full time and with pay. And so I think that underscores some of the notes I was making earlier about how we need more opportunities for people to join this field as their full-time profession. I think internships through universities are a really good way to bridge this gap to begin with, because oftentimes universities have funding that they want to give and want to provide to students who can then go into other organizations and work. So that sort of kind of bridges that divide between organizations not having resources to bring people on in paid capacities, universities wanting to place their students. And I think a lot more of that, where there are lots and lots of paid opportunities for young people to join organizations that they would otherwise only be able to join in a volunteer capacity, I think would be a really great way to start. Just one other thing on the comment about disconnection from actual change. I mean, I do think that these organizations have a lot of power. In Harvard's context, I'm sure many of you have heard that this organization that's been going on for more than a decade just succeeded in pushing Harvard to divest from fossil fuels. And that was an entirely volunteer-based organization and effort that led to real meaningful change within the organization and a large institution. So I think it does drive change and policy, but I don't think that it is particularly ethical to ask people to spend all of their energy and time doing something that they aren't compensated for. And I think that there are resources and there is financing that's available. It's about matching it up and making sure that there are the opportunities for people to do this full time.
Great. I have a few more questions. The first two I'm going to direct to, I'm going to just read them all out in the interest of time. The first two I think I'll direct to Alexandra, because I think they fall in sort of your wheelhouse of research, and then a comment for the panel. So first, from Howard Covington, chairman of the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, why aren't there large-scale protests on campus about the failure of politicians to act on climate as there were about other issues in the last century? And then somewhat relatedly, from David Mednikoff, professor at UMass Amherst, I'm proud to say a Harvard alum from our department and from the law school. What about broader public awareness, anxiety, and activism around climate change? Because of the technical nature of the field, it can be challenging to engage the public at large, at least the US, on this question. So how might this change? Or is it more effective to focus on diversifying and expanding the professional core and organizations dedicated to the field? And then let me throw in one last question for perhaps Naomi and Clea, from our very own executive director of the Weatherhead Center, who co-sponsor of this event. How can young people, Ted Gilman, how can young people and everyone work to change the system from within and from outside? Business as usual emissions and agriculture must change. Are jobs available in the finance and consulting space for young people who want to change the world in this way? And I think this really is a crucial question in light of the fact that we know a major player here is the private sector, whether it's finance or other elements of the private sector. And so, how can we get beyond greenwashing and have some real commitment to change within this sector? So Alexandra, let's start with you.
Hi, so thank you so much for this is an amazing question. I wish I could dedicate more time to thinking about this question. Maybe I will in the future. I would say off of my head, why aren't there large scale protests on campus about the failure of politicians to act? I mean, I think my first impression is just that youth today are aware that the university isn't where the action is happening. Aside, you know, as Clea just mentioned, we've seen Divest Harvard just have this massive success. So Harvard students that are passionate have poured their time into trying to achieve that kind of a win that would actually, you know, result in a real change, and it would be impactful because it's actually in Harvard's purview. And we do see protests outside of university campuses led by folks even younger than myself, that went on for over a year of, you know, every Friday protesting, and many students even sat out and went on strike. You know, they refused to go to school until they saw action. I think there's still this question as to maybe why university students haven't led more of a grassroots movement. And I think that speaks to the research I discussed at the start. It's about how we are all too aware of just how vast the problem is. And so it's hard to collectivize for what feels like a structural issue. And again, it's this despair. It's this feeling that, you know, what's the point? Why would I skip class? And, you know, maybe I won't study as well and I won't be able to get the mark if it's probably not even going to do anything. I'm better off putting all my effort into getting the grades, and then hopefully one day I have a position of power where I can make some kind of change. So I think that, you know, that's the bulk of what I would say to that question. And I think it also points to what we said earlier about political action. I think youth need to be aware that there are multi forms of action, because that's the only way they're going to feel they have agency. It's not just about the political, which I used to think. I used to think that it was all the action had to be at the political, and that was all I cared about. But I started to see that if you think that way, you're never going to feel like the hope that you need to be driven. So we also have to look at the corporations and as Clea highlighted so well, the nonprofit sector. And Melani, can you remind me, there was a second question as well. Was this about the technical nature of the field from David?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So this is also such a great question. I spent some time this year researching educational initiatives on climate change within the public school systems. What kind of education are students receiving from, you know, Dustin mentioned his 4-year-old child. When is his kid going to learn about climate change from a teacher in school? And I think a lot of this, you know, it seems too technical and too vast. I think that could be broken down from an early age in the school system. I think even allowing students access to nature will help them to understand the problem, and it'll feel less technical. It'll feel like there are grassroots things they can do, you know, it doesn't have to be a technical challenge. It's at its very core, as we've discussed, it's a challenge it's an existential challenge, but it's also something that binds communities together. And so I think that by integrating more climate change education in the school system from a young age, students will feel prepared to know what kind of role they'll have. And I think something to add to that that's very interesting is the Sunrise Movement actually came up with a quiz that you can take, and it's a personality test. And it assigns you basically a role. What's your role in the climate movement? And I think that personality test is really cool and important, because it highlights that there's a role for a caregiver in the climate movement, because the mental health burden is vast, you know. So every person has a role, and things like that, to show students that from a young age, I think that could be the push to help bring down that barrier.
Excellent, thank you. And Clea, I'm going to turn over to you to address Ted Gilman's question. Do you need me to remind you about working in the private sector, jobs in finance and consulting?
Yeah, I think that this is a very good question. And I think that if we are going to achieve an economy-wide transformation as is required for this crisis, there will be jobs in the private sector, of course, that will need to drive this change. And I think absolutely this is just as important to make sure that we are pipelining people into. I think right now, a challenge that a lot of my friends seem to face is that they take these jobs in finance or in management consulting and don't have a lot of ownership and leeway on what they consults on or what they're using their position to affect change within. So I have friends who are consulting for oil and gas companies, and that's not what they really want to be doing, but that's sort of what happened when they took a big corporate management consulting job. So I am not by any means an expert on what goes on in those corporate settings, but I think absolutely we'll need consultants to be able to come into government contexts and to be able to come into renewable energy company contexts and advise on how to do operations better. We'll need obviously gigantic amounts of financing to fund the transition. So I think, of course, we need young people in those roles. We just need them to be in positions where they feel like they're able to contribute to this transformation that we're trying to achieve. And we need all projects to be aligned with the transformation that is required.
Great. And I think we might have time for one or two more questions with quick responses, because I know we have to turn it over to the Majlis. So this question in the chat is from Claudia DeWint, who is Executive Director of the Inter-American Institute of Justice and Sustainability. And she says, participation and access are commitments in the UNFCCC when it comes to climate action and its implications, but activism alone will not raise the bar. Using institutional mechanisms for citizen participation, such as courts, is doing so, albeit at a more gradual pace. So her question is, can youth create awareness on existing mechanisms for participating on how to do so constructively? And then let me throw out one last question from Malik, Dahlan, specifically directed at Naomi. Malik says a point related to what Dustin mentioned about international experiences on climate is that one of the fundamental climate challenges and potentially solutions is addressing green energy finance and development in Africa. But this is a really contentious topic in the build up to COP26. Is there, a more fundamental problem here relating to quote unquote saving lives in Africa? How does this potentially relate to Black Lives Matter issues related to race relations in US discourse? So let's start with the first question about other mechanisms for participating beyond activism. I don't know if, Naomi, do you want to kick us off on both questions and see if the other speakers have anything to add, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure, I could do that. Thank you so much for the questions. I think to address the first question, this summer when I worked at my job, we talked a lot about solutions, and that was really refreshing for me because I think, especially in college, young people are inundated with, this is the problem, study the problem, how did the problem come about? But I think more and more, and I think what we definitely need more of when it comes to climate action, and that word is super important, is the solutions. So what are we doing locally? What are we doing? How are we mobilizing? When Alexandra was talking about protests, where exactly are we putting our energies and our focus, making sure we're not just screaming into the void, being mad at the government? How are we hitting Harvard where it hurts in their pocketbooks? And locally, I think as young people, we can do a lot. If we decide we're not going to school and protest, that hurts the economy in the future. We want our children to go to school. So I think that's why we have those targeted approaches to demanding exactly what kind of climate action we want. I think more and more young people are aware of that, and we don't want to just waste our voices because we understand exactly how crucial action on this is going to be. I hope that addressed the first question enough and more people can speak to that. But for the second question, I love this question. I think about this a lot. I think in the developing world, and I hope this is changing, but again, like it has been in Black communities in the US as well, climate can sometimes be seen as a privileged issue. When there's starvation and there isn't the infrastructure for it, why are we advocating for solar panels on people's houses? Like that doesn't seem to line up. But I think more and more we're talking about how there is space for that, how there's an opportunity if a country is underdeveloped to make sure that the grid is ready for electric vehicles in the future, that we don't develop in the way that the US did. We have to understand the US was not a model for development. Yes, it's very prosperous right now, but there's no way that everyone in the world can eat like Americans do, that everyone can drive huge cars the way Americans do. And so I think there are spaces and there are conversations more around how green development can happen in these countries, but I think there needs to be a mentality shift that this is not a privileged thing. This is something that needs to happen. And there are ways that in the developing world, life is more sustainable. Maybe the diets there are more sustainable, and that needs to be carried through. We shouldn't all want to live the way Americans do. And then there needs to be a shift, I think, in the developed world as well, to not see certain places and people as waste. I think what I'm studying in the US right now is that a lot of times Black communities, communities of color, low-income communities are seen as wastelands. And that really hurts us because we are never forced to internalize the externality of pollution. We say that's going to be somebody else's burden. That can go to a developing country, that can go to, you know, the neighborhood on the outskirts of the city where we can put our power plants, where we can, you know, have excess emissions. And so I think once we have that shift in mentality, we understand that, no, we're all in this together. We can never have, there's no trash can, you know, of the globe. We can't just put that onto anybody. And to address your question about Black Lives Matter, I think what that movement fundamentally is about is dignity in human beings. So when we recognize that people have dignity, there's no human being on the planet that is just a wasteland. Like, no one is just someone we can dump all of our issues onto. So yeah, I think there's a twofold shift that needs to happen. I think it's mostly on the developed world, but I do think there's also space to see that climate issues are not just a privileged thing, but there is a possibility for that to happen in the developing world as well.
Great. I'm so sorry, but I believe we're out of time at this point. So I really very much appreciate the contributions of Alexandra, Naomi, Clea. You guys are just fantastic. Keep up the great work. And thank you to my colleague, Dustin Tingley, for his excellent work and contributions here today, and also to the Scotia Group for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you so much for everyone attending and your very insightful questions.